True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on. On a Thursday in June 2019, Anne, a 98-year-old former yoga instructor suffering from dementia, passed away in a Melbourne nursing home. Now, an elderly woman's quiet death in a suburban aged care facility wouldn't normally garner international press attention. But the passing of Anne Hamilton-Byrne made headlines both here and overseas. Her passing, described by a detective who knew her true identity, as the end of the life of one of Victoria's most evil people. Anne Hamilton-Byrne was the leader of the cult known as the Family. Now, you may have seen photos of those children lined up in perfect symmetry, their hair dyed blindingly bright blonde, their clothes similar to those worn by children of the royal family or the Von Trapps from The Sound of Music, all matching. The boys in velvet blue jumpers, the girls in floral dresses, knee-high socks and Mary Janes. These children were not Anne's, but they called her mother. Many adopted from parents who worshipped the woman who claimed she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. But when 3 of those children escaped and went to police, the world of the family would come crashing down, leaving those who knew no other life than one of complete control under the hand of Anne Hamilton-Byrne to start over. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. If you were to travel to Lake Eildon in Victoria in the 60s, 70s and 80s, like thousands of Australian families did and still do, you would find an idyllic Australian setting, a place you and I would have loved to have set up camp, with its lush greenery and secluded waterfront property. It was peaceful. That is, until you walked a little further and found the property known as Kalama. For the Lake Eildon compound, with all its tree-lined beauty, was also a prison, wrapped in barbed wire to keep the dozens of children who would call it home from wandering too far from the influence of Anne Hamilton-Byrne. Anne, the glamorous yoga teacher to wealthy suburban Melbourne mums, with her polished blonde updo and her shining, perfectly touched-up lipstick, managed to convince up to 500 adult followers to join her at Lake Eildon and other properties in Melbourne and across the Dandenong Ranges. She went from teaching them how to stretch to teaching them about her reincarnation, claiming to be the embodiment of Jesus Christ. On that Lake Eildon compound, Hamilton-Byrne had curated a family, gathering children, some of whom were adopted under suspicious circumstances, whose outward appearance of cherubic angels or dressed in matching outfits covered up a life of fear and torment, of drugging, brainwashing, beatings and starvation. One of those children was Ben Andrew Shenton, who at age 15 was finally rescued from the clutches of the cult leader and sent back out into the real world with a lifetime of obedience and servitude, punishment and reward, the only things to base his new existence on. Ben sat down with us to remember his life in the before and the life he's managed to reclaim and create in the after. Ben, thank you so much for agreeing to chat to us today. I would like to start from a point where you're not even in existence yet, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Because you were born in 1972 and you're a planned pregnancy, but not in the way that, say, parents of 2025 are probably planning a pregnancy. Can you explain how you came to be in the first place?
Sure. Let me give a very brief overview of a woman called Anne Hamilton-Byrne. She had her own major issues in life, a broken family, her own mental issues. She was a control freak, as I cover in the book, so very much looked to create a world that she controlled everything. And the 60s brought up a existential threat, which was nuclear warfare, and the belief that Vietnam War, communism flowing through everything. So the Western society was dealing with issues that they were seeing in their lounge rooms now, on TVs, in newspaper articles that weren't there before. So it gave in the 1960s in Australia, Melbourne, it gave an impetus for a belief system of this, what we're being told doesn't work. Let's try something different. So my mother, as I worked out, became involved in this. She started going down the path. She had her own issues in her marriage, as happens. Others say she had an idyllic marriage. Jewish community, things seemed to be very good. They were, from the outside, everything was fantastic. But she says it was a very difficult marriage. She had physical issues due to having had car accident, had whiplash, had problems with her spine. And so she had major medical problems. Became involved in Hatha Yoga. The leader of the cult started that, was teaching it. And my mother got involved and then began to experience at a time when she went for some back surgery. There was no 2025, even 15 years ago. You were able to do keyhole surgery, fix the issues with the spine, take out a little bit of the vertebra, and the nerves are released. Back in the 60s, the Mayo Clinic, which she had connections to, had no answers. She was about to go in for some exploratory service. Anne Hamilton-Byrne knocked on the door. Her eldest son invited her in, and she told my mother, if you follow me, I'll heal you. And my mother at that stage is looking for an escape out of what she called a loveless marriage. She's bedridden, in a lot of pain. She's rejected her religious groundings, which is Christianity and Judaism, and looking for Hatha Yoga into the occult. And Anne claimed to be the reincarnation of Jesus, had seen healing happen. She experienced it. So that was a start in my mother's life that transitioned away from her own autonomy, her own family, into handing that over. She said that Anne called her back from the dead, gave her a new life, a new start, and a future. Then Anne claimed as well that the world's going to be destroyed by nuclear warfare, and you can be part of creating a brand new start. At the age of Aquarius, which you go back into the 60s, is an occultic belief that there are ages and there are beings, the Great White Brotherhood, if we go back, that will send individuals down that will rescue society, give it these shifts. Jesus Christ, one, Muhammad's another. You go through all the prophets, they just name these the different embodiments of them, and then Anne claimed to be the latest embodiment. So my mother was convinced of that, left a loveless marriage, and then Anne said to her, you need to have a child that's not a Jewish. It's okay. So the master, reincarnation of Jesus, the avatar of Christ, has given her a direction. And so that's what she did. She shacked up with an Englishman, Peter Shenton, and I came along.
So Anne says to your mother, you need to have a baby that's not Jewish. So she gets pregnant with Peter, and then 18 months later, she decides to say to your mother, hand that baby over. I mean, you obviously know what happened now. Can you give us an idea of like your mum's state of mind when she's asked to hand over her 18-month-old child?
Yeah, and I've talked to my mum as I built a relationship with her, and set it up so that she sent my father over to England, back where the cult functioned as well, turned my mother into a single mother, asked her to look after one of her properties in Australia as a caregiver, and made it clear that she could give me the best life possible, far better than what my mother could. And the other thing in here is, think of this, if you believe that your guru has requested something from you and is going to recreate the world, and your child's been chosen to be one of those people to do it, that's a pretty heady request. You are one of the chosen. Your child's been picked. And as Dr. Raina Carey-Johnson, who was the master of Queen's College, one of the founding members of the cult, said when he wrote his memoir on this stuff, is that Anne Hamilton-Byrne knew who would be born, who they'd be born to, where they would be, and would gather these children. So my mother is convinced her son is one of them, who's been specially selected to restart this world and bring it into a brand new phase.
So whenever we hear or read about the family, it's often accompanied by that photo of the children lined up in symmetry, wearing the matching outfits, with all your hair dyed blonde. When you see yourself in those photos, what are we seeing in the eyes of yourself, your brothers and sisters, as you're posing in these group shots to show just how perfect a little family Anne has created for herself? Like, what do you see when you look at those pictures?
Yeah, it was just life. We were her children. We were different ages. We'd line up Von Trapp style, The Sound of Music, which we'd watch, dressed in outfits that matched, and that was just what we were asked to do and did. You look back on that and you see it was choreographed as you look in that, and I'm the same. And indeed did craft a belief that she had these children, which she didn't. We were all either adopted or handed over. So she lived a lie, she created a lie that shows the level of control she had over people to be able to present something that wasn't true.
Do you believe that she chose to dye your hair so that you would look more like Anne, because Anne was blonde herself?
100%.
Do you think that was the reason? Because there's often been some discussion around whether Anne was actually trying to achieve something racial in building this cult and this army, and that she wanted a future where it was white people as the strongest, that there was this link to this Aryan race idea.
I don't know about whether she was going further. Definitely the first one's correct. She wore blonde wigs. Her hair was blondish. Yeah, so I think she was trying to make us appear like that. Some of the girls and some of the guys she didn't. So they would look like her husband, what was that, the third husband, Bill Hamilton-Byrne, black hair. Her daughter, who was her real daughter, Natasha, she had red hair, so a couple of them were allowed to have red. So I think she was trying to present that this is what it was. But running in the background as well, remember, is she was planning on presenting, once the world went through the nuclear holocaust, this group of children that were not going to be children by then, but adults that were going to take the world over and recreate everything. So how that was going to happen, good luck with that. It never happened, thank God. But that was the plan.
Well, it's really interesting when you talk about the plan, because we all presume that in a cult, the cult leader would want their followers to be as uninformed as possible. They want them to believe only what they tell them. But from what I was reading in your book and from interviews that you've done previously, I realized you were all very well educated, like to a point where when you got older, a lot of you were sent off to boarding schools in England, where you said the other part of the cult was functioning. Like, why educate you so well?
Yeah, and I think the failure here is she didn't realise that knowledge is power. Now, what was fascinating, though, is that we'd often get newspaper articles or newspapers with articles cut out. So we were getting filtered information given to us. Everything that came in was monitored, controlled. So part of any culture is you control the narrative. Now, that sounds freaky, but it happens all the time. Editors decide what goes into papers. You've got, I guess nowadays it's a lot easier to get information out there, but there were gatekeepers. And so every culture has gatekeepers. And even in my own home, there were things that I would elevate as good, that I wanted my kids to do. If they did it, I'd reward them and say, this is good. We'd celebrate their successes. And if there were failures, they didn't get talked about all the time. They were dealt with. You would work through those, but they weren't elevated as something we'd always talk about. So every healthy culture and unhealthy ones, they control the narrative. So Anne did the same thing. What I think she missed, though, is that the more intelligent and the more information you give people, then they can analyse and criticise. And I think that's the piece she missed, is you look back on it, yes, dumbing people down so they don't question is one way to handle it. But then you can't, there's no critical thinking, there's no ability to be able to manage stuff. So I think she wasn't as smart as she thought she was. So how I speak about it is she did a very good job of bringing the plants up in the greenhouse, but she never thought how they're going to function once you put them out in the world. So she had a plan. She carefully crafted them, made the perfect environment to make sure that these plants were going to be good and strong. But when it came to getting them out into the world, abject failure in almost every case. And I just don't think she thought through that.
I read about how your days were structured at Kalama, and from an outsider's perspective, it seems like a very healthy and well-rounded way to live. You get up early, you do yoga, you have a vegetarian breakfast, you meditate, you are educated at your homeschooling, there's more meditation, lunch is again vegetarian, and then there's maybe more yoga. It seems like a really healthy way to bring up a child. But can you tell us what was happening in those days? Because it was very monotonous, right? It was the same thing pretty much day in, day out.
Yes.
What was that like for you, just to go through those motions every single day? Because you were doing that for 13 years.
Yes. And monotonous is correct. Now, you then have the underlying education happening. You're then doing critical analysis. You're then realizing this is not the best, as slowly, bit by bit, information starts to filter in of what was around us, what society had happened. I mean, you start to study World War I, World War II, history, concentration camps, and we'd call ourselves a concentration camp. You begin to join the dots. So this was the challenge. And then some of the girls in there, I mean, as you talk about Sarah, who went on, became a doctor. There's another girl there who studied psychology. Others had businesses. I mean, by and large, a group of quite intelligent people. And that would be the synopsis of a lot of us, that when we were pulled out, there was an element of intelligence there. So with that came frustration, anger. So we all responded differently, and everyone does respond to environment differently. Two of the youngest ones, for example, their bodies stopped producing growth hormones. So they were underweight, under height, and that's called psychosomatic dwarfism. So the body, when it's under long-term emotional stress, will just stop producing growth hormones. And then when they were removed, they went up to standard height, standard weight. So there's that response. My response was complete compliance. As you read in the book there, I made a decision early on. We're all dragged into a room. Someone's broken the rules, stolen something, that they shouldn't have. I can't even remember what it was. But we're all interrogated, who did this, whoever doesn't say, you're all going to get punished. And I just decided I did it just because I don't want to live with that fear. And then I worked out after that, I'm not going to do this. If I know if someone's done this, I have this inbuilt sense of justice in me that can be useful, can also be very difficult, get us into trouble, but this inbuilt sense of right and wrong. So if I knew someone had done wrong, even though wrong was in a rule book, that you and I might look at that going, no, that's not wrong, that's harsh and cruel, but that was the rules. That was the morals defined for me. So when they were broken, I would tell on who did it, and that created an incredible tension. So there was this underlying responses to how we all handled it. Some outwardly rebelled, some completely complied, some had physical issues of just shutting themselves down emotionally. Others lived in a fantasy world. I mean, there was all many, and others just held themselves. I know one of the girls, she just said, I just held myself as to who I was, almost rocking back and forward. I didn't allow myself to feel things. So there was very different responses. So that underlying clashes of how things happen created a very toxic environment, to say the least.
You mentioned the rule book. Can you give us an idea of what this is? Because you talk about it in an abstract way, but it was a literal physical rule book that Anne had created and had attached punishments to rules that were broken, and they were physically signed off, like actually her signature on the bottom of these pages to say that this is what the process is if you do break said rule. Can you give me an idea of what was in that rule book and the punishments that would apply to those things?
Okay. So some of those things would be, if someone was to wet their bed, they would get cold shower, miss out on meals. That would be one. If someone was to answer back to one of the caregivers, we call them aunts and uncles, they were doing what was called Guru Seva, service to the master, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off for a lot of the aunts. They were very regimented on what we could and couldn't do with them. If we answered back, punishments were defined. And then Anne would make them up as she went. There was a period of time there where it was, a rule book said you would be dunked in water. if you disobey, if you steal. So you'll read the book, it's stories of 2 occasions there where vitamin C's got stolen. The Rulebook said that's belting, that's dunking in water. So that's what happened at that time.
And when you say dunking in water, it doesn't mean just throwing you in the lake. You were held headfirst underwater, right?
Yes. So it would be called water torture. So we were all lined up. We were belted, a bucket of water, our head held under the bucket of water, interrogated. Did you do this? No, I didn't. Head under, hold there until you thought you were suffocating, brought back out again. So horrendous experience. There's no two ways. I mean, it caused, nightmares. It caused major issues. These things shape your personality, is what happens. And anyone who's lived under domestic violence will know it. The living with fear, the walking on eggshells, the currying favour with those in authority, or the absolute rejection of them, the hatred of them, the love-hate relationship. I mean, it's, as I said, as I've lived life and started dealing with people, you go, yes, this is domestic abuse on steroids that tragically many women and indeed some men go through. It's not just men and women, children live with this. So it wires you a certain way that you end up with pathologies that Anne used to control us. And this was the evil genius of her. If she understood if she could separate us, isolate us, make it so that we couldn't build relationships with one another and punish us, then she could control us.
Can you tell me about how she would make you compliant in the punishment process? I saw an interview that you did where you got quite emotional when you talked about telling on a brother who had respiratory problems, and then he would end up locked in cold, dark sheds and, would be suffering for days on end. And now that you reflect on that, you understand how awful that is. But at the time, you felt like you were doing a good thing, the right thing. Can you just talk to us about how Anne made it so none of you could ever really connect with each other?
Yeah, and so when the connection was attempted, Claire, what she would do is she would separate you, or she'd punish you for it, or she'd set you against each other. So she set herself up as, if you tell and you give me information, I'll reward you. If you form a relationship with someone, which is a hedge against having a relationship with me that I can control you, I'll destroy that. So 2 of the girls, Sarah and Antoinette, highly intelligent. They were good friends and made sure they were both brutally punished and separated. So they were not with us in the same bedroom. They were separate meals. They were made to sleep in a bathroom by themselves. This happened again and again, this type of abuse. As soon as you began to form a relationship with someone, Anne would find it and make sure it was torn up. So you couldn't build a friendship with them. Because any friendship then means you have an emotional barrier against the abuse. It protects you. So by stripping that away, you then create the direct connection to you. So she would then take people away with her. She'd try and form a bond with them. And then she would violate our trust to show that she was in control. So she's making very clear, I control you. Everything that happens in your life, I control. Stay on my good side. We're good. Become my enemy. Your life's not worth living.
Can I ask then about how connected Anne was? Because, yes, she threatened people in this kind of spiritual way, but she could make people's lives difficult in the real world. Because when we look at who was attached to the family back in the 70s and 80s, it was people that I know, like Reg Ansett, the former owner of Ansett Airlines, who owned a TV station at the time. He would reportedly quash any stories that would come out about the family. Yes. There was also connections to possibly even the Victorian Premier at the time, the Liberal Party. There were doctors, psychiatrists. Like when we think about cult sect members, we think of really vulnerable people, uneducated, who are sucked in because they, are promised something, like the way that your mum was. But the reality was Anne was connected to some really high-profile people who helped her maintain this facade cult for a really long time.
Yes. And that what I guess was slightly unique here, in that she connected with the intelligentsia through Greg Johnson. So he was the Dean of Queen's College. He had incredible influence and he had his own connections. 32 years of functioning at that level at Queen's College in Melbourne University. brings with it a lot of kudos and a lot of respectability. Whenever there were any issues, she'd trot him out. Whenever there were any problems. And he had his own connections. A lot of those connections you spoke of were friends of his. So he was convinced that Anne was who she claimed to be and recruited for her. So if it wasn't for him, I don't think the cult would ever have gone anywhere. It just would have been this kooky woman who was a yoga teacher, wielded some spiritual power, helped some people, but he gave it validity. He gave it respectability and the connections that came with it. So he would make the phone calls to his friends and get stuff to happen. So that was a major, major coup. And any idea, any movement that starts, they always say, this is Project Management 101, it's the second person who's the most important. It's not the first leader. The second person validates it. So you can have someone dancing on the side of a mountain. There's a large crowd around them, but it's when someone else joins them, the second person, that validates this person having a dance by themselves. And others go, oh, this is fun. And then you suddenly get a whole group of people dancing in the meadow. So this was the key here. And he had incredible influence. And to the day he died, Anne used him to deflect and used his connections. And it's interesting, he died, from memory, it would have been February, maybe March 1987, and the cult got raided August 1987.
Interesting correlation of timeline there, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it is.
Up next, Ben reveals how Anne used LSD and other drugs as a tool to manipulate and control children in her cult, including him, and describes just how far Anne's influence extended. As I mentioned, some of the high-profile people involved in the cult were doctors and psychiatrists, and you have mentioned that LSD played quite a role in the sect members' lives. You didn't get to that point because there was some kind of age limit put in place for the children to use LSD, but you were put on quite a few other prescription medications. Can you talk to me about why the children were medicated and how that was weaponized against them at times?
Yeah, it's a very insightful question. And yes, had psychiatrists, psychologists around her. And what was fascinating, I mean, you take the Whittaker and John McKay, they were both psychiatrists that were, and I think Whittaker, from memory, was actually given the authority by the government to put together a body that would analyse the effect of self-regulation around the use of LSD. Once again, we're talking the 60s, even now. Psychiatry saying you can microdose on LSD and it can be beneficial for major mental issues. Well, back then the CIA, and we go into, and I don't want to overspeak this, but LSD was seen as a way to be able to help people. Okay, so it comes into Australia, supply lines here. The Australian government says, let's have a look at this. They put Whittaker in charge of it. He works at New Haven Hospital and's got a connection there with the matron, has access to all these patients and has access to LSD, and began to utilise this to control people and threaten people. If you don't fall in line with me, I'll put you into New Haven Hospital, and did that.
Did she do that to her husband's ex-wife?
So that's exactly what happened. She
right.
arrived there and was given appropriate care because she was, poor girl, was tormented and struggling. So yes, that was done and used that. And look, you read Sarah Hamilton-Byrne's book, Unseen, Unheard, Unknown. She documents what she went through. It's tormenting. I mean, I watched what's done to her, what she went through. And Lexter Mann, who was responsible for investigating, it was put in charge by the Victorian Police. Eventually there were others, but he eventually was the detective in charge of this. It was able to extradite her, and he did a lot of interviews, like hundreds of hours of interviews, had those tapes. His synopsis on Anne is she was one of the most evil people that ever lived. Some of the stuff she did to people when they were under LSD, Sarah was one of those. It's nothing short of criminal. Nothing short of criminal. She used it to manipulate, to control. You do that to a 14 to 16-year-old, when their brain's still being formed. We know that LSD affects the frontal part of the brain that's not developed till you're 25. You have flashbacks. You physically assault people with weapons during that time and violate them. You're going to control people. You're going to rewire them. You're going to do things to them that's wicked. And that's what Anne used. She understood the power of psychotropics. She understood what she could do with them, as many spiritual people do. You'll follow many, many religions throughout the world. And there's the use of lotions and potions and putting people into an altered state of consciousness that opens the door. One of the words of witchcraft is pharmakia, pharmaceuticals. You're able to get into an altered state of consciousness where demons can get in and do things, as well as change the biochemical neural paths of people, especially in the formative years. So it was wicked. And yes, as I said, yes, I was on medication. And to this day, I really don't know the effect of it. I don't know. I know that I was very photosensitive to light. I know I was very emotional.
That brings me to my next question, because you talk about other people getting involved, because other people did ask questions over the years, and you would have come in contact with the outside world because you did on occasion leave the property and interact with the public, but you were told or scripted things to say to people, and you were told to remain as unseen, unheard and unknown as possible. But what would happen if people came to the property? I know there's that footage of a journalist in the 80s who's come to ask questions, and she says, are there children here? And they say, no, there's no children here. They deny everything. Where were you guys when people would come to the property and ask questions?
Downstairs. So the entry to the property, which Maui Moore, Channel 9, I believe, who's remained a friend for decades after. So she took a real interest, began investigating. She came, asked the questions. We were downstairs. There are other times, especially when I think a girl went missing. Her father ended up actually going, I think she was taken to New Zealand. The mother was connected to the cult. He began to, obviously as a father, make a lot of noise about that. And police came looking around. And when that happened, there was a period of a couple of years, I think, where we would get police randomly coming. We were told what to say to them. We were told we were to tell them we went to certain schools. At night we'd be removed from our bed and find ourselves woken up, hidden under the house. We'd go through the boys' room, through a pump room, through a small hole in the wall, which in the book I've got a bit of a mud map of that to show people. And you'd wake up in the dark, fearful. The police told that they'd take us away and drown us in the lake with bags and whatever else. So, and set up the outside world as to be a place to be scared of. The authorities were evil. They were going to hurt us. We were safe with her. So that was the mentality that we had, and the use of psychotropics and the rest to control and manipulate.
Can we talk about the many faces of Anne Hamilton-Byrne? Because when I first saw a picture of her, she was not what I expected her to look like. And when I first saw footage of her, it wasn't what I expected, because we are brought up to believe that evil exists in a monstrous package. And Anne was far from that. She was beautiful. She was very cultured. She was very well put together. In footage, she seems very happy and lighthearted, and she seems really adoring of you as her children. How do you think she was able to exist as that person, and also as the person you described, the master manipulator and the one who would control absolutely?
And they live side by side. The ability with a sociopath or psychopath, and I think in the book I try and lay out what are the attributes of a psychopath, and I think Anne matched that. This ability to be able to live in two worlds, this ability, this awareness of they can do things to people with no conscience because they see the end result justifies the means. So most of us have some level of moral code that says that's off limits. That's not appropriate. I've just violated someone's space. I've just taken away their autonomy. I'm a missionary in an Asia-Pacific nation. There's a default respect for a minister. That can be very dangerous because therefore it means if someone's in need, I can use that respect immediately to control them. So when you build this And it's spoken about how abuse happens to children. Okay, so you get an adult that comes in saying, I want to help you, but there's this power base, this where you can manipulate and use your power incorrectly. So a sociopath, a psychopath has no qualms about doing that. They don't think twice. In fact, they perfect the art of that to realize that the outcomes I'm after are so important. I don't care the collateral damage. I see people as a farm to field, not as an army to equip. I see what I can get out of them. I see what I can use for them for my master plan. And they perfect the art of being able to do that. And that's how you look at what is a psychopath. And then looking what Anne did, I said, I believe it. So I put that in the book, a bit of a chart. That's what I believe she is and she was. It's a great question there, Claire, this ability to be able to be so warm, so loving, so caring, and yet at the same time so manipulative. Well, sociopaths, psychopaths have that ability.
You've already mentioned your sisters who ran away or escaped over the years. They would come together and go to police and tell them that children were definitely being abused at Kalama. And in fact, they had collected physical documented evidence to prove that that was happening so that they would not be able to say, we checked and there was nothing happening. They had actual proof. So can you take us to that day in the 80s, 1987, when you were about to head off to boarding school? This was your ticket out of Kalama, right? You were ready to roll.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, police have surrounded the property.
Yeah. So that process didn't happen overnight, as you said. So one of the girls ran away. That was Leanne, the eldest, ended up getting herself a job, doing what she needed to do. Another one of them, Sarah, she got thrown out of the cult because her relationship with Anne had become quite difficult. She was doing year 12. She was living down on a set property closer in Melbourne, Upper Ferntree Gully, and Anne was controlling her by removing her access to toilets, to function. So her response had always been one of rebellion. That's just how Sarah functioned. I refused to comply. So she forced a confrontation. And over the years, when Anne was trying to take us out of the greenhouse and put us into the real world, the girls, she thought the best thing is finish school for them, let them go and learn dancing. So I went down to the Ken Laurel School at the foothills of Ferntree Gully, I think it was. Both Sarah and Leanne formed good friendships with the two sisters. Those two sisters, Anne allowed them to spend a weekend with them. They realised what they were going through was horrific, and I think that triggered their determination. Well, what happened here when Sarah began to rebel against what Anne was doing is she invited one of these girls' mothers to a cult property, which unseen, unheard, unknown, you don't do. She did it again to force a confrontation and got kicked out. And so, of course, she went to live with Kathy Fern. Now, Kathy's best friend happened to be a lady called Helen Gibbont, who's a private investigator, a Christian, who had a lot of documentation on Anne, and began to show that to Sarah to help her get her head around. Then another one of the girls had gone to boarding school. Her parents had given her some money, and she was living with a non-cult member going to Brighton Grammar. So the three of them got together and had asked for the Rulebook, which we'd managed to get down there, how that worked. And the day where it happened, the Rulebook had been stolen. The aunts had realised things are getting out of control. There'd been stuff going on, and Bill Hamilton-Byrne had been sent back to calm the farm. See everyone, it's all settled, you behave yourselves, I'm here. The video that many people saw of Anne singing was brought back to say she loves us, we're here, everything's okay, I'm going to come back for you, all that sort of stuff.
Because she was overseas at the time and she would spend a lot of time overseas. She didn't spend a huge amount of time at Kalama. Her aunties kind of handled everything, right?
That's right. And even when she was in Australia, she'd spend time down in Melbourne, close to the cult, going along to Santa Kita Lodge on the different nights. So we rarely see her anyway. Bill had spent 2 weeks with us. He sort of calmed stuff down as much as possible. We were going to go out on a houseboat that day, which rarely ever happened. This is incredible. We're going to go on a picnic. And 7:30 in the morning, and that's the day when the three girls had gone to the police with the documents, as you said. They'd realised there was a genuine domestic violence case happening. So I think it was the CPS, the Community Policing Squad from Nunawading, organised 100 police to descend and get us out of there. So, yeah, as you said, my hair by this stage, it was no longer blonde. It had been turned to my natural colour. And I knew I was on the fast path to leaving. So we're doing our hatha yoga meditation. We're here running, stand on the steps leading down to where we were in the boys' room downstairs, and thought it might have been the aunts. Quickly assumed the right position, the right location, and these strangers turn up. And it's on for young and old. So mayhem, trying to work out what happened. I think, was it Sarah, one of the girls, I'd have to think back, but they were there to say, hey, it's okay, we're here, we're going to help you, you come out with us, we've got a bus, it's all going to be okay, we're going to rescue you. So the thought of being rescued was, why would we need to be rescued? And as you said, I'm planning on leaving anyway. And so when they took us upstairs out to the bus, I remember grabbing a hold of the balustrade at the top, not letting go. And as I cover in the book there, it was, I don't know what was going on in my brain. I just froze. I'm not leaving. And as you said, I think subconsciously I realised I already had a ticket out of here. Why would I go with these strangers? And then I think I got this epiphanal moment of realising this is the ticket out of here. So I let go and I went with them. And as we drove away, I remember saying, a page has been turned. We finished one chapter, another one's been started. It ended up being almost, without overstating this, but that's what happened. That's, it's almost like I understood what these three sisters of mine had done, in inverted commas. The girls growing up with us, is they had rescued us. And now the ball's in our court. What are we going to do with this? And that night I'm lying in bed, where we're down in a reception centre. I'm on a bunk bed, first time I'd ever been in one, new pyjamas, brushed teeth. I'd eaten a meal. I'd been able to go into a kitchen. I'm free. And I'm checking through everything I'd said that day, which is what you did unseen, unheard, unknown. And I said something I'd get into trouble for, which often I had in the past. And then I realised I don't have to do this anymore. I'm free. I don't need to go back. And that, to me, was when I shut the door, never returning. I made a decision that night. Whatever I needed to do not to return, I was going to do. I was never going back.
Next, Ben shares what happened when he discovered who his biological mother really was, how he tried to foster a relationship with her, but was immediately shut down, Anne's reign of terror extending far beyond the reaches of the Kalama property. But then later, why that would all change. Stay with us. Not long after you are freed, you speak to your mum, really for the first time freely speaking to her and understanding how you came to be in Anne's care. But what was that interaction like? Because you've grown up in a place that has isolated you for 13 years. You haven't really known affection. You haven't really known love, especially not the parental love that is such a founding thing for most of us in the creation of who we become as humans later on down the track. You've been devoid of pretty much all of that. You speak to your mum. Were you hoping in that moment to get that love and to get that connection and attachment? And tell us what actually happened when you did speak to her.
So 100% Claire, that's exactly what I was hoping for. When I realised very quickly that Anne was not my biological mother, great relief. I'll never have to go back, I'm free. Then anyone around the age of, so what, I'm 14, 15 by that stage, add another 20 years. So anyone between the age of 35 to 55 lady, I'm thinking could be my mother. Who could she be? And hoping for that, hoping for that bond. I've seen enough movies, I've been around enough people to know that this, as you said, it's a bedrock, foundational thing that we all crave. And even me growing up, I crave that. I crave the love of a mother and affection and care and validation as a human being, because that's what a lot of it is. It's you're being validated as a human being, that you're special, that you're important, and they help to shape your character and direct you down in the parameters of love anyway. So that's what I expected and hoped for. When I got told that my mother was Joy Trevelyan, Auntie Joy, that was a bad day. That was a very bad day. And the reason it was a bad day is because Anne, in her evil genius, had set Joy up to be this person that we all hated. She looked after the place Anne lived in during the week and would say to different ones of us, come and spend the week with me. When she was in Australia, she'd ring Joy and Joy would go, no, I don't want them to spend time with me. We'd stay up there. So you can imagine this woman, as far as we're concerned, is stopping us from spending time with Anne. We hate her, even though I'd met her when I was 11. So I never met her, but Anne set her up to be someone to be hated. So when I find out she's my mother, that's the background. And then, yes, shortly after, get a phone call from her in a voice that I began to learn was Anne's voice. She put this voice on when Anne told her to say something, and basically, you're an embarrassment to me, don't bother turning up on my doorstep, I'll slam the door in your face if ever you bother to do that. And the tragedy with that is that my half-brothers, 12 years older, 17 years older, 20 years older than me, two of them, or in fact the one who's 12 years older, had quite a good relationship and had understood that Anne was under controlled her. So he understood this, kept a relationship with her. He was in his mid-20s. He went to see her and got told, I think, went to see her or got rung and said if he ended up seeing me, she'd never speak to him again. And that's what happened. It's like another one went to see her in where she's living, talking about me, and got told the same thing. Don't have anything, you're not to talk to him, you don't have anything to do with him. He's very forthright, began to challenge her and just stopped talking about it. John, my father, Peter Shenton, was back in Australia, sort of stepped in. We knew him as John Trevelyan. He stepped in saying, you're upsetting her. Please stop talking about this. So he was okay. And had nothing to do with him. So that shut down any possibility of me having a relationship with my mother, which stayed that way until I think I was about 33, so almost 20 years ago.
How do you then, Ben, go out into the world as a free human being? You're a young man, you're still at school, you're trying to connect with other kids, I imagine, your own age, which would have been incredibly difficult because you've never connected with kids your own age before, despite at times being around 28 odd of them on the property at Kalama at any one time. How do you start to form relationships with people when you lack the skills to create relationships with people?
Very awkward, Claire.
I can imagine. They must have thought you such an oddity when they would first meet you, when you first were free, I imagine.
Yeah, and one of those names given to me was Psycho, because I was unpredictable. I mean, I'm trying to process relationships with people. I'm unpredictable. At times I would struggle with relating to people. I would get angry very quickly when things happen. I couldn't control things. I was socially awkward. Some of them are very kind to me. I mean, I tell one story in the book of a group of English students that were my peers that took me on as a English project on the advice of the English teacher. I was surrounded by some very kind people, and they did their very best to integrate me, to help me, but I was an oddity. And I took a trip around Central Australia, went with a couple of friends and came back with no one, not due to their fault. I just struggled to relate to people and connect with them. I lived in such a different world with different values and had nothing in common. So I'm going around Central Australia, I'm in tears one night, things are blowing up, and Peter Frost, the maths teacher, he actually said to me, Ben, your fellow students have known each other, you're in year 11, for some of them 11 years. You're a new start, you're awkward, you're struggling, you need to give it time. I mean, they were sage, wise words, but they didn't help me. So I realised when I came back from that trip, I had nothing to connect with people. Cars, I'd never had interest in them. Sports, I'd never really followed or known. I had no similar experiences. So I had to work out how socially awkward I was. And I remember coming back going, I feel like I'm sinking in a river and I refuse to do it. I'm going to find out what I need to swim and survive. Whatever it takes, I'm going to work that out. And I think in year 11, I repeated it. Went on, did year 12, sort of struggled through it, struggled with deep depression and other things. But yeah, I fortunately had a foster mother who was very, very good to me. That helped a lot.
Your foster mother was also born-again Christian.
Yes.
And faith has become such a big part of the second chapter of your life, which I find incredibly interesting. And I hope this is not offensive.
No, go, ask away.
It feels like if you were in a cult, why would you seek religion after finding freedom? Because religions are often spoken about as if they are a cult in themselves and would require you to fit into a certain belief pattern and belief system.
Yeah.
Was that the reason why it made sense to you? What was it about faith and religion that helped you after being so controlled by somebody up to that point?
Yes. And I would say it's going to have to be a bit of a long answer to a very well thought out question. There's a couple of things here. First thing is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So that's part of it. What Anne did was evil. She used the name of Christ to give herself validity. She used a belief system. So what I began to realise from the shattered perspective of what I'd grown up with, how do I fix this? Now, I didn't go looking for God. I didn't go looking for religion. Many of us that grew up with this ran to the hills, as you would. You would assimilate anything to do with someone who's giving you boundaries to live within to be destructive and to be evil and to be horrible. But we all live within boundaries. They're called laws, don't they? We all live with a moral code. I worked at IBM. We have the 139 principle. 1 vision, 3 values, 9 practices. So you have a vision, you have values, it bleeds through everything. And I began to realise that every culture has this, the underlying legal tenets, CULT. Now, what changes them as to whether they're good or bad is to what they are. What is the belief system? So why I guess what happened to me becoming a Christian is I began to realise that God's not evil. He does exist. He has laid out his word. He can reach down supernaturally and make a difference in our lives. And the explanation also is there's a malignant evil force that's there. Can I see that play out? So study of history, and as I said, this becomes a long thing, which we don't have time for today, but I began to really unpack this, look at what had happened to me, understand the spiritual influences behind it. And then God reached down. I had a vision of Jesus Christ. My foster mother had an impact. She didn't talk to me about God, but I just became curious, began asking questions. And Jesus Christ met me. I had a vision of him. What happened, though, is I then acted on that. And I think that's the difference. I had a spiritual experience, but then I could look at the word of God and could see that matched that. And then I began to read his word, began to live it, began to make it part of my life. So, as I said, I've just lived that, and it's worked and worked very, very well for me, as it has millions of others.
While Anne has been nearly 6 years in her grave, it might surprise you to know that the cult we know as the family still exists. And while it may not be as influential as it once was, people are still seduced by its promises, influenced by its teachings, and controlled by its masters. Thank you to Ben for sharing his story with us today. His book is called Life Behind the Wire. We'll include a link to it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is hosted by me, Claire Murphy, and produced by Tali Blackman, with audio design by Tom Lyon. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.